Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Pond's mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 21. Today, Paul and I are delighted to be joined by Dr Merrick Burrow, Head of English and Creative Writing at the University of Huddersfield in the UK. Merrick is a specialist in Victorian and Edwardian literature with significant interests in critical and cultural theory. His current research projects include work on literature and magic, Robert Louis Stevenson's travel narratives, detective fiction, and the cultural history of deception. And it's in connection with the latter that he's curator of the Cottingley Fairies, A Study in Deception, an exhibition at the Treasures of the Brotherton Gallery at the University of Leeds, which is also available online. Merrick, thanks very much for joining us on the podcast.
It's lovely to be here.
Before we start on the questions proper, as it were, Merrick, could you just give us a brief background to the story of the Cottingley Fairies, just for those of our listeners who might not be over familiar with the story?
Yes, of course. So the story begins in 1917 with Francis Griffiths, who was aged 9 at the time, and Elsie Wright, who was aged 16 and who was a cousin. Francis had come to the UK from South Africa, where she'd grown up, when her father was brought back to fight in the war, and they were living together in a fairly small house in Cottingley in the West Riding of Yorkshire. The story of the fairies begins really with Francis, who used to go down to the beck that ran behind the house that they were living in, and regularly came back with her shoes wet and got scolded by her mother. And one day, her mother demanded to know what it was that sort of attracted her to go down to the beck all the time, and she announced that she went to see the fairies. This was met with skepticism and mockery, but her cousin Elsie decided to back her up, and she said that she'd also seen fairies there too. And after a few weeks of joking and mocking around this, Elsie came up with the idea of playing a kind of prank, returning the favour on the adults in the family by photographing some fairies, cutting out. She would draw the figures and then cut them out, and then they would take a photograph of them by the banks of the beck. So they borrowed Elsie Wright's father's camera. They went and took the photographs, and when they came back with the negatives, lo and behold, the fairies appeared, and the adults were puzzled by them. I don't think anybody believed that they were fairies, but they demanded to know, how they'd done it. And the girls had made a pact that they were going to maintain, at all costs, that these were genuine photographs. They're going to maintain the joke. And so after some more weeks going on, they said they'd go and take another photograph to prove it. So they went and took a second photograph and brought that back. And more questions ensued, but they stuck to their story. And then nothing really happened for about 3 years after that. It was talked about in the family. People in the village knew about it, but they'd stuck to their guns and hadn't confessed about how they'd actually made these fairy photographs. And then the two girls' mothers went to a lecture at the Theosophical Institute in Bradford, which was about fairy life. And at the end of this lecture, they happened to mention about these fairy photographs. And people there were very interested, so they brought them in. And from there, it came to the attention of Edward L. Gardner, who was a fairly significant figure within the Theosophical movement based in London. So he came up to well, he wrote initially actually to ask if he could see the photographs, he could borrow copies of them, and then from Gardner. Taking copies of the photographs and including them in the lectures that he was giving in London, they came eventually to the attention of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And when Conan Doyle heard about them, he initiated a bit more of a thorough investigation of them, with Gardner acting as the intermediary. And he then published the photographs in the Strand magazine in the Christmas issue of 1920, and then got the girls to take some more fairy photographs with new cameras that he prepared, and those photographs were then published in a couple of months later in the Strand magazine in 1921. And then there was an understandable controversy. Lots of people thought that Conan Doyle had kind of lost his mind, really, and there was lots of skepticism, lots of mockery, but the girls didn't at that point admit to the deception, and indeed it carried on, occasionally coming to public attention again over the next 6 decades. And it wasn't until 1983, really as a result of a couple of more or less independent investigations, one by the president of the British Photographic Association and another by a man called Joe Cooper, that both more or less simultaneously published evidence to suggest that these were indeed faked photographs. And it was at that point that the two, by now old ladies, admitted to what they'd done. And then it became clear that the whole thing had been a deception.
That's a great summary of the case. I mean, one thing that immediately fascinates me is how it was that it came to run for quite so long. What perhaps was in the mind of the girls to stick with it, even when it was getting all of this public attention?
I think, to some extent, once they'd gone beyond a certain point, it was very, very difficult for them to back down from it. And I think that point came fairly early on. So when Gardner was making his initial inquiries, the family were not wanting to engage with it, really. As I mentioned before, the mums had gone to this meeting at the Theosophical Institute and had shown the photographs. These had been circulating amongst enthusiasts, if you like, in the local area, and they'd started to produce prints of them, to share as this wondrous revelation. When Gardner got in touch, Edward L. Gardner from the Theosophical Institute got in touch to ask for copies of them. The family didn't really want to engage with him. So the initial correspondence was with a woman called Edith Wright, who was no relation, but was a sort of intermediary. And she sort of brokered a deal, really, between Gardner and the family to get access to the photographs. And I think really what seemed to be pivotal was Elsie Wright liked the idea of kind of getting one over on her father, who I think had been particularly skeptical, but also, from what one gathers, was quite grumpy. And it was a very. I think it's also, you have to kind of bear in mind the circumstances in which they've been living.
Yeah.
I mean, by 1920, the Wright and Griffiths families, the war was over. They the father had come back from the war, and they were living. I think the Griffiths family were living in Scarborough by this point. So they weren't all on top of each other. But at the time when the photographs had been taken, it was a very, very difficult time. There were two families living in a very small house together. Arthur Griffiths was fighting in the war. The stress of the situation had caused all of his wife's hair to fall out. And it's clear from the correspondence that Arthur Wright was, pretty open in saying he didn't really kind of like having them there and so forth. So, this picture emerges of a sort of fairly grumpy character. And I think Elsie, who was, a very, very spirited girl, rather liked the idea of, her father ending up in believing these fairy photographs in spite of everything. So I think it was probably a little bit of mischief that made her then initially agree to engage. But once they'd engaged, and then particularly once Conan Doyle got involved and started sending book copies of books and writing directly to them. Conan Doyle, who was obviously by this point one of the most famous literary celebrities in the world, to be kind of showered with this attention. offers of money for a dowry, because by this point Elsie was engaged and she was going to be married, and the family then starts becoming much more cooperative and engaging. And when he says, "Could you get some more photographs?" they say, "Well, of course we can get some more photographs." And the girls at this point then start to be kind of coerced into it almost by their family, saying, "Come on, you must take some more photographs for the nice, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle kind of thing." And obviously, once they were published, they were initially published with the girls' names changed, and some semblance of anonymity, which didn't last for very long at all. And then I think it just would have been impossible for them to really back away from it. They also said, or Elsie Wright said later on, that they felt a kind of pity, really, or they felt sorry for Conan Doyle. I think they were aware that he'd lost his son to the influenza pandemic at the end of the war, that he'd lost his brother-in-law and other family members, and that through that experience of loss, I think they felt that to some extent explained why he'd bought into the story of the fairies, and they didn't want him to be publicly humiliated. And I think similarly with Edward Gardner, those two in particular, because they'd staked their reputations on it, they didn't really want to have them publicly humiliated. And of course, Gardner carried on. He didn't die until I think the late 60s.
Wow.
Might have even been later than that, actually, come to think of it. So it went on and on and on for decades in any case. And they only really admitted it in the end because they've been rumbled.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting excuse me. And one of the things that's quite amazing about this whole story is that it hinges on these photographs, which I guess to our modern eye, you look at them and they're quite clearly fakes, but the photographs themselves, the original negatives don't exist, do they? And so what are we actually looking at when we see the photographs that Conan Doyle printed?
Well, that's a really interesting question. The photograph that the most famous photograph, the one with Francis and the fairies on the bank with the sort of toadstools in front of her, that's the most famous one. That was the first photograph that Elsie Wright had ever taken. And then the second photograph was of Elsie with a goblin figure, which was the first photograph that Francis had taken. But Francis was 9 years old, so even less adept at taking photographs than Elsie. So they were very underexposed. The second one was very underexposed. And the first one was quite grainy, and even though it's rather beautifully composed, because I think Elsie's got an extremely good artistic eye, it was nonetheless quite a poor quality photograph. When Edward Gardner got hold of the negatives, what he did was, he asked a man called Harold Snelling to do two things. One was to evaluate whether the photographs had been faked up in a studio, whether they were double exposures or they'd been mocked up in some kind of sophisticated photographic studio. Harold Snelling, being a photographic expert, and particularly in producing various kinds of special photographic effects. So, he's an appropriate person to get to evaluate that, because he will be able to tell through a kind of forensic analysis whether the photographs have been faked up or not. And he looked at them and he said, no, they've definitely not been faked up in a studio. They're not double exposures. They've been taken out of single exposure in the open air. And so that all sounded quite good. Gardner then said, well, could you improve the quality of the photographs so that they'll work whilst I'm giving these lantern slides? He wanted them to have maximum impact. He wanted the photographs kind of cleaned up, really. So that's what he did. He asked Harold Snelling to improve the photographs, and so Snelling used some kind of special process which seems to involve various things. So he removed some of the foliage that was towards the top of the scene. He did some mechanical reduction with kind of grinding paste to lighten certain areas of it where it was overexposed or underexposed. And interestingly, he also added details to the wings, more or less by hand. So he he's doing two things that seem quite contradictory. On the one hand, he's evaluating whether the photographs are fakes, and on the other hand, he's actually enhancing the fakes, making them more convincing, more aesthetically striking, and more distinct. And so this process involved enlarging them. It involved various actual kind of changes to the photograph structure itself, and then rephotographing and enlarging and rephotographing through sort of 5 stages. I think when there was an analysis done by Geoffrey Crawley of the British Photographic Society in 1982, he identified, I think, 5 stages to the process that Gardner had taken them through, at the end of which you get these glass negatives that are the ones that are in the Brotherton Library. But Crawley's analysis of the photographs concludes that all the prints that have ever been made and published and put into circulation are from the negatives that are in the Brotherton Library, and that when Gardner lodged them, although it was his estate that lodged them, but the way that he labelled them, he intended them to be understood to be the originals. So he kind of suppressed the original negatives, which is one of the layers of deception in the story, because Gardner, whatever happened to the original negatives, and it's not entirely clear exactly what happened to them, that they're not the ones in the Brotherton Library.
Yeah,
and they are, I think, a 5th generation improved version. And so all the prints that we know are from those negatives. It's just they're not the originals. There's only, I think, 1 or possibly 2 extant prints from the original negative.
Wow.
In existence.
That's quite amazing, isn't it? It's incredible to think that these images, which are so iconic, are not actually the original images. But I mean, also that sort of hints at one of the other odd elements to this story, which is the copyright situation on the photographs. And I think you made the comment, Merrick, that the girls never saw a penny from this, and there's a whole copyright ownership issue around the prints.
Yeah. So when the question of publication was first mooted, and Conan Doyle and Gardner were liaising with the family about that, this was to print in the Strand magazine and in a sister publication in the United States. The original idea was that they wanted to shield the girls and the family from unwanted, intrusive infringement on their privacy, really. And I don't for a moment doubt the sincerity or genuineness of that. I don't think there was any intention to try to cheat them. And it was really to try to encourage them to agree to publication by, taking away some of the things that they might be concerned about. And part of that was that they would copyright the photographs in Gardner's name. So again, the copyright wouldn't be something that would be traced back to them, but it would only be a temporary copyright agreement just for the purposes of publication in the Strand magazine and the American sister publication. After which they were quite explicit: the copyright would revert back to the girls, who took the photograph, as it normally would do. I think it was complicated by a couple of things. One was that the family sort of disavows maybe not the right word, but they certainly didn't seem to pursue the financial aspect of it. I mean, partly because I think once the publicity came to them, Frances in particular, hated it. She it kind of spoiled her life really in many ways. So she wasn't looking to profit from it in that kind of way. They'd also, Conan Doyle had given Elsie some money. They'd given them various kind of gifts, books, cameras, and this sort of thing as well. So I think they felt like they'd already kind of had some benefit from it. But also because all the prints were taken from these photographs which had been changed by Gardner, materially improved and changed by Gardner, he retained the copyright. The negatives, as I said, went back to the family. But then there's some sort of question about whether Gardner then got them back later on. There's a really intriguing correspondence that crops back up in 1946 this is in the archive, between Gardner and Edith Wright, the initial intermediary, who, once she'd served her purpose, it's pretty clear from the correspondence she was frozen out, and Gardner just didn't get back to her when she tried to contact him. So she writes this rather sort of sarcastic and bitter letter in 1946 to him, saying, I see you're still dining out in the Cottingley Fairies kind of thing. But in that, this correspondence between them, there was this sort of suggestion that I think in the last letter she wrote before that, which is back in the 1920, she says the negatives are back in my possession. I suppose you'll want them again. And then there's nothing until 1946. So we don't know where those negatives, the original negatives, ended up. Whether Edith Wright kept hold of them, whether she gave them back to the family, whether she gave them to Gardner and he kept them, and they've been lost somewhere. Certainly, Francis and Elsie didn't seem to have them. They didn't know what happened to them. They thought that Conan Doyle and Gardner had never returned them. Maybe they went to their parents, and their parents, weren't particularly interested in them, and they just got thrown out or broken or something. But so the copyright that existed, and that still pertains to this day, is in Edward Gardner's estate's name.
Wow. Amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Presumably Gardner's initial motivation was genuinely wanting to use these photographs to promote his theosophical ideas, to use them as proof of a higher order of beings and so on. And then the case just took on a life of its own.
Yeah, I think that's right. He was quite explicit in his early correspondence with Conan Doyle about not wanting to bring the question of money into things, because he felt that as soon as you started talking about money, it would muddy the waters. It would give perverse incentives for the girls or the family to say whatever they thought was going to be the right answer. So they wanted to, he was very clear, he wanted to keep it a pure inquiry in order to establish the truth, because he felt it was really important. It was really Conan Doyle who insisted on introducing the business elements into it, and not, again, I think, out of any sort of sense of avarice or acquisitiveness, but simply, Conan Doyle was a professional writer, and his time was worth a certain amount. He got a lot of expenses. He was supporting not just his own household, but also a hugely loss-making spiritualist bookshop, which was really important to him. He was funding this lecture tour of Australia he was about to go on. He was doing a lot of work that meant that he couldn't do other work, which would be making him money. And so, it was important to him to value his time. But he said that he thought a fair settlement would be for 50% of the proceedings to go to him, because he was doing the majority of the work, and then for the other 50% to be split evenly between Gardner and the girls. But he sort of left it to Gardner to decide on that. And I think because the girls weren't particularly proactive about it, and because there was all these ambiguities around it, it didn't really kind of work out that the girls really got a proper contractual arrangement about anything.
What do you think it was that drew Conan Doyle to this case in the first place? I mean, there seem to be a number of reasons. I mean, in the preface to his book, The Coming of the Fairies, he's very careful to differentiate the fairy case from his main campaign for spiritualism. But what do you feel was his motivation? What really drew him to this particular case?
Well, I think it was spiritualism. I think that's what he was clearly really interested in. I mean, the Coming of the Fairies, where he expands on the contents of the original Strands magazine articles, is, I think, quite an interesting book, where it seems to me that Conan Doyle is sort of trying to present a version of himself as being very skeptical and rational and objective and so forth. And I think it's for the purposes of that, it's quite important for him to draw a separation from the areas where he's got this overt and clear public commitment to spiritualism. So I think to some extent he's playing a rhetorical game with all of that. But the origins of his interest in it were that he was writing a series of articles for the Strand magazine about various aspects of the paranormal, and he got one planned to write about fairies. And these were kind of general interest articles, really, that were talking about the history of folklore and that kind of thing. It wasn't meant to be a kind of evidence-based analysis or case for fairies or anything like that. And that was the reason why David Gow, who was the editor of Light magazine, the spiritualist journal, got in touch with him when he heard about Edward Gardner's Theosophical lectures featuring these photographs, and said to Doyle that he might want to find out some more to include them in this article. It was round about this time that Conan Doyle was his friendship with Houdini had reached a level where Houdini was trying to get spirit photographs out of Conan Doyle. And was pressing him for contacts with spirit mediums. And Houdini was working Conan Doyle, I think, fairly clearly to try to sort of get access to people that wouldn't otherwise have had anything to do with him, so he could debunk them. That was his main objective. And Conan Doyle came across the fairy photographs at this point, and I think there's a letter, I think, where Houdini asks for if he's got any spirit photographs that he could show to him, and he says, I've got something even better, I've got photographs of fairies. But I think that once he'd heard about them, and then when he'd actually seen the photographs that he got from Gardner, who sent him a copy, he started to think that here is empirical proof, and if you can have empirical proof of something supernatural, preternatural, like fairies, his view was that then becomes the opening of a gate. You've crossed a line into, if you believe that, then getting people to believe in spirit photography is a short step. Believing in spiritualism more generally is a short step. And so for him, it was really a strategic move, I think, to present people with what he considered to be empirical evidence of the supernatural. And that was, I think, what's really, really interesting to Conan Doyle, because it's that connection between the material, the empirical, and this sort of mystical beliefs that he's got, and it's the intersection of those things that seems to be a recurring interest and source of fascination for Conan Doyle going back decades, really. It's not just at this point, but I think that was the sort of the thing that the fairies and the fairy photographs really offered to him, was this way of providing a manifestation of the supernatural.
Yeah, I think just an aside on that, when I was looking at the coming of the fairies again recently, I was really struck by how Conan Doyle is setting himself up against the sort of norms of Victorian science. And he has this line, the recognition of their existence, of fairy existence, will jolt the material 20th century mind out of its heavy ruts in the mud and will make it admit there is a glamour and a mystery to life. And, later he says, Victorian science would have left the world hard and clean and bare like a landscape in the moon. But this science is in truth but a little light in the darkness, and outside that limited circle of definite knowledge, we see the loom and the shadow of gigantic and fantastic possibilities around us, throwing themselves continually across our consciousness in such ways that it's difficult to ignore them. And, you get that sense in which he's committed to the romance of discovery almost.
Absolutely, yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the other things about it, and I think this is where Conan Doyle saw himself, was that I don't think he saw himself as being set up against science. I think he saw himself as participating in a debate within it.
Yes, absolutely.
And so he saw materialism as sort of one strand within Victorian science, and he saw it really as a form of bigotry, a sort of a closure of the mind to other possibilities. And so, when you get people like Edward Clodd and so forth attacking Sir William Crookes and Sir Oliver Lodge for being, gullible and believing in spiritualism, Conan Doyle's view was, well, Sir Oliver Lodge and Sir William Crookes are eminent scientists. They're much more eminent, members of the Royal Society and the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Who are you to challenge their credentials? So he placed himself on one side within that debate. And I mean, in The Coming of the Fairies, there's some fantastic sort of lines of argument. There's one where he talks about, he uses Lodge's theory of the ether,
Yes.
and to explain how, in the same way that a body can disappear when it enters into water, that if you pass into a different set of kind of existential wavelengths or something like that, that you could appear and disappear in the way that fairies do.
Yeah.
Like I think he talked about a seal or an amphibian or something on the bank of a lake going into the water, and you can't see it when it's in the water, but it can move between the air and the water, and that's what fairies can do, moving between two different states across this etheric boundary. And he uses this to explain why fairies appear to children.
Yes.
Because children have got more sensitive apperception. Their senses are able to detect light wavelengths that become desensitized in adults. And he's got this fantastic idea that at some point some psychic spectacles will be involved,
Yes.
and then everybody will be able to see this. And I mean, one of the wonderful things that happened whilst I was preparing for the exhibition and kind of word got out about it a little bit was that somebody from Sotheby's contacted me and said, we've got some of these psychic spectacles, that were made in 1920 something, and they're like the old-fashioned leather flying goggles.
Oh, wow.
But with darkened lenses, and then they're lined with this kind of fluffy fur. And the idea is you put these things on, and they were fairy viewing goggles. And I said, well, Conan Doyle literally describes these psychic spectacles. So they then advertised them. They auctioned them as psychic spectacles, and they sold last year, I think it was. But it's fantastic. But that idea that it was something that was so based in physics. And that gave kind of credence to it. That it wasn't just appealing to some sort of mystical ideas that required belief, but that there was solid, hard science of physics behind it that could explain it. And and he's constantly reaching for these speculative explanations of things. And for him, I think he saw that materialist refusal to entertain the idea of these kind of wild speculations as being closed-minded, and that he and people like Sir Oliver Lodge were the true spirit of scientific inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
Do you think this is also the sort of background clash in Conan Doyle's own origins, and that he's from an artistic family, and he himself has had a scientific training as a doctor, but his father, Charles Doyle, and his uncle Richard Doyle were both notable fairy painters. So he's grown up with this in his background, this whole cultural aspect of fairies, and Andrew Lycett argues in his biography of Conan Doyle that part of the reason for Doyle wanting to prove the photos are genuine is almost to justify his father, who was written off as off with the fairies and mad.
Yeah. I mean, I can accept that argument. I think to some extent. Clearly, Conan Doyle wanted to kind of redeem that family legacy, and was interested in the fairy paintings, and in all of that, and was justly proud of it as well. And his own relationship to his father, I think, is quite complicated, and to his uncle as well. It is fairly complicated. I'm not sure that. I mean, from what I've seen of what he's written, it does seem to me that his interest in the fairies was, at least on the face of it, primarily a means to an end. I think it probably was quite nice to have that endorsement of fairies, and the idea that these intuitions of his father and uncle have some kind of greater substance than just being these sort of evanescent fantasies. So I think I can sort of buy that argument, but I still do think that ultimately he was really interested in the fairies as a means to an end for his his agenda with spiritualism.
I mean, one of the things I was really taken by in both the online exhibition, which we've been able to see, but also in your talk, was Conan Doyle as a tactician in a way. By this time he's a seasoned campaigner. You've got Edelgee case behind him, the crime of the Congo. He's been a political campaigner on a whole range of different fronts, and it really struck me that he brings a lot of that to bear. The fact that there's the exchange, I think it's the exchange with Gardner, where he's already commissioning a second set of photographs, knowing that he's going to release the first set and use that to draw the fire, and then he's going to hit people with the second set. There's quite a lot of, almost military strategy gone into how he's going to fight this campaign.
Absolutely. I mean, his rhetoric in those telegrams and so forth between them from when he's on the lecture tour in Australia are steeped in military rhetoric. I mean, of course, during the war, Conan Doyle wrote a lot of articles for the Strand magazine about the military campaigns of the war. So all the kind of tactics of attack and counterattack and all that sort of stuff will be very familiar to him anyway. And he was a war correspondent as well in the 1890s for a little while. So I think all that military tactician stuff, he would have felt very much at home with all of that. But yeah, I mean, he talks about having left a time delay mine. We went off on the lecture tour. And left Gardner sitting on top of it, and he says it with a kind of glee as well. He knows. I think this is one of the things about the whole case that I think is really interesting. Is that it's not as though he was surprised by the reaction to the publication of the photographs. He knew that skeptics, that his opponents, his enemies, probably, I think he would have seen them by this point, would have leapt on it as an opportunity to ridicule him, to criticize the photographs and pick out all the things. So he to some extent, he was keeping his powder dry, to have this second set of photographs to publish straight afterwards. And he'd taken a lot of care with the second set of photographs to do exactly the things that people like Harry Price, who was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, but also a friend and associate of Harry Houdini, who was exposed and debunked fraudulent spirit mediums. He used a lot of the techniques that were used there in order to be able to show that, yes, we've done the things that you would have done to prove that they were frauds, and they weren't. So there's the same year that he published the Coming of the Fairies, he published the Case for Spirit Photography, which was about the William Hope, the Cruise Circle, and Harry Price had caught William Hope in a fraud by having some photographic plates marked with X-rays that he then gave to Hope, and when they were returned with the spirit manifestation on them, the X-ray markings weren't there, so Hope had substituted a different plate for the one that Price had given him. Conan Doyle had the plates that were given to Francis and Elsie for their second group of photographs all marked in a similar kind of way. He gave them cameras which he'd had bought, so all those questions about things that might have been done to fake the photographs were taken into consideration, but he didn't make any announcements about those things. I think he wanted to draw as many of those sorts of criticisms as possible that he could then answer with a second set of photographs with all the information about how they've been done. And that is very, very strategic and tactical. He knows that he's entering into a campaign. He's not just publishing them naively, or not completely naively anyway.
Yeah, and it's a pretty vitriolic exchange. I mean, I think you mentioned in your talk about sort of the marginalia. Is it by Edward Clodd?
Yes.
He sounds like he's got. They've both got sort of very het up on both on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think when Conan Doyle first became public in his conversion to spiritualism, he'd been interested in spiritualism going back to the 1880s. And I think had always leaned towards the idea that it. He felt there was something in it, but he'd always sort of sat on the fence a little bit. When he finally publicly converted, I think he started to experience a different set of responses to it, because he wasn't, a group of people who are part of a group of people who are interested in spiritualism. He was now, leading the campaign for people to accept it, and so he became, I think, perceived as a target.
Yeah.
And particularly because he had such prominence, not only as a very recognizable literary figure, but also, of all things, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. So when Conan Doyle gave his endorsement to things like the fairy photographs, I think it drew a tremendous amount of hostility, not just because they felt he was wrong, but because it was as much about influence on public perception and public opinion as anything else. So it became quite personalized. They were seeking to destroy his reputation, to have him perceived as a fool, as gullible, and so forth. And so, Edward Clodd, I think, he wasn't just being strategic about it. I think he felt, intensely furious with people like Conan Doyle for buying into spiritualism and fairies and all the rest of it, and then publicly endorsing it. So his copy. I mean, he wrote a book about spiritualism and evaluating the case for it, which in itself is incredibly rude about Conan Doyle and the like. But then not only does that, but then he collects all these clippings where other people have been rude about Conan Doyle, and pastes them in, and then writes his own kind of comments in the margins. There's photographs for the Strand magazine, of the first set of fairy photographs. There's letters or notes that Conan Doyle has sent to Claude. Really quite sort of good-humoured ones, saying, there's one where Conan Doyle said, you and I disagree on this stuff, but I've got the advantage because if we meet in the hereafter, I'll be able to say, hello, Claude. It turns out I was right. Kind of thing. Well, Claude's pasted this into his book and written these kind of like furious, grumpy, marginal comments about what an idiot Conan Doyle is. That's, and he entered into public debates with Joseph McCabe, who was another. I think he'd been a Jesuit priest who turned arch kind of anti-spiritualist skeptic, and various other people in the kind of scientific establishment or kind of rationalist press association, who were really going hammer and tongs to get Conan Doyle, to disprove the points he was making, to generally, pull his arguments down and reduce his reputation, to the point which, when the fairy photographs came to his attention, and Doyle sent them to Sir Oliver Lodge for his opinion. Sir Oliver Lodge's close associate, J. Arthur Hill, who was, also a long-standing associate of Conan Doyle, wrote to Conan Doyle and said, I'm convinced that Edward Clodd's behind this. That the whole thing has been set up to try to discredit the creator of Sherlock Holmes, because once your reputation's been trashed, people say, well, if the creator of Sherlock Holmes can be deceived in this way, then what good is anybody else's testimony?
Yeah.
So they, Hill thought the whole thing was a setup from Edward Clodd, and that. It gives you an idea of the level of hostility that there was towards Conan Doyle and spiritualist movement that was emanating from Clodd and his associates.
And Sherlock Holmes comes into this as a very double-edged sword, because it's the reason why Conan Doyle has the platform, really, to be able to make his case, but also his opponents are very happy to use that against him, and that's probably the most abiding thing that anybody knows about the Cottingley Fairies case, which is that how is it possible that the man who created the great rationalist detective Sherlock Holmes can believe in this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I was doing some research in the University of Cambridge library, where the archives for the Society for Psychical Research are held, and I was looking through some of the correspondence between Conan Doyle and Sir Oliver Lodge. And J. Arthur Hill, as mentioned a moment ago, sort of acted as secretary for Sir Oliver Lodge. So he'd intercept the mail, he'd read it, and then he'd sort of write on it to Sir Oliver Lodge what he needed to do, like you can ignore this, or just write back saying thank you, or whatever it might be. And the correspondence from Conan Doyle, they sort of, Conan Doyle started writing to Sir Oliver Lodge, very, very kind of enthusiastic, gushing kind of messages where he was expounding his own theories about things, and Hill's sort of take on it was, well, you need to respond. You probably don't need to kind of respond in detail to the things he's saying, but you need to sort of keep him on side. And then on the outside of one of the envelopes, he writes, it would be very useful to have a Sherlock Holmes on our side. In court or in just for public opinion. And part of the reason that they were keeping Conan Doyle on side was because mediums were being prosecuted and imprisoned around this time under the Vagrancy Act. So there was a whole kind of other dimension to it there as well, that the spiritualist movement was kind of semi-criminalized because of these actions that have been brought about by initially by Edward Lancaster, and it was emerged from the scientific establishment wanting to challenge it on as many fronts as possible.
How much do you think as well it is to do with the timing? The fact that you've got this story emerging at the end of the First World War, which is a hoax that's got out of hand. And then at the beginning of the First World War, you had the whole story, The Angel of Mons, which derived from Arthur Machen's short story, The Bowman, which then got syndicated. This was the idea of bowmen from the 100 Years' War, their spirits appearing to help the British troops during the retreat from Mons. And this idea got into the culture in a big way once it was syndicated. And soldiers who were actually on the retreat would then insist they'd seen these creatures. And the public took this up, and same with the Cottingley Fairies, that it just then takes on a life of its own. But is it this particular time in the First World War that really gives all this stuff impetus, and the loss of life and the incomprehensibility of the war, as opposed to the age of Victorian rationalism?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's the impact upon the war, and it's it's a different kind of war than anybody's experienced before. So yeah, that whole thing of a whole generation of young men going off and just not coming back, that question of what's happened to people, just disappearing, and the First World War also resulted in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, didn't it? Which is, I think, in a different kind of way, an attempt to address the same sense of loss, that it might have been your son or your husband or whatever, because the whole point was it's somebody that they definitely don't know who it is, so it might be them. That tremendous desire to have some sense of kind of this person not just kind of vanishing out of the world, but them being somewhere.
And this higher order of beings, this beneficence, the need for this in people's minds, for this to exist. Otherwise, you'd be driven mad by the results of the war.
Yeah, I think. I mean, the fairies. I mean, particularly those photographs are so sort of charming and enchanted, aren't they? They kind of hint at a different kind of world that's so different from the what's people have encountered in the war. I mean, the other thing that's sort of interesting in relation to the war that connects to this, I think, is what Frances Griffiths writes about in her memoir. So she started writing a memoir in the 1980s, late 70s actually, about the Cottingley Fairies, and she wanted to tell the story from her own point of view, which and then rather ungraciously got gazumped by Joe Cooper publishing. He was working with her on it, and then he published broke the story himself. So she stopped writing the memoir, but in her account of the early days when she arrived in Cottingley, she talks about seeing. She maintains that she did see fairies, but they weren't these evanescent sort of sylph-like winged figures. They were little men, and they were platoons of soldiers that marched up and down the bank, and they're very, very similar to the descriptions that she gives of travelling on the troop ship and then on the trains up from Plymouth, where they landed when she came from South Africa, up to Cottingley. She talks about seeing them as like railway porters. One of them was a regimental sergeant major, and it's difficult not to sort of contextualise that in relation to what she's feeling about her father, who's gone off to fight on the Western Front. Who was a regimental sergeant major, and who would, parade the soldiers around. So that sort of sense that the fairies, in her mind, as well as more generally in the public mind, are acting as some kind of compensatory manifestation of the things that everybody is so troubled by in relation to the war. I mean, there's a huge upsurge of interest in spiritualism around this time. That's you can see quite empirically, actually. If you Google has this thing called an engram, where you can type words in, you can look at the number of occurrences over time of these words in all the publications that have been digitized. And if you put spiritualism in to this Google engram, you get nothing prior to the late 1840s, when the Fox sisters first started doing spirit rapping, and then it surges up around the time of the American Civil War, then goes down again. Then there's a big resurgence of interest in the late 19th century, and then it goes down again. And then from the start of the First World War, it goes almost vertical, the graph.
Wow.
And then it goes to 1920, and then it just sort of tails off and never recovers. It's interesting to think that the Cottingley Fairies might be the reason why spiritualism never recovered, because of Conan Doyle's gamble on the photographs not paying off.
Yeah.
But it's very, very clear. You can see it with the American Civil War, and you can see it with the First World War, that you have these huge surges of interest in spiritualism around this time, when people are dealing with this huge industrialized slaughter campaigns.
It's fascinating to think that this could have been the nail in the coffin for the spiritualist movement.
Yeah, I mean that's my my guess is that what Edward J. Arthur Hill writes about Edward Clodd, his suspicion that Clodd is trying to ruin Conan Doyle's reputation as a way of finally defeating spiritualism. He was clearly alert to the possibility that this would be devastating for the spiritualist movement if Conan Doyle's gamble, was proved to be wrong, as indeed it was. I mean, and even though Elsie and Francis didn't publicly admit until 1983 that they'd faked the photographs, I think it was very clear from a lot of the public reactions that people saw them as being manifestly fakes. I mean, they weren't necessarily sure how it had been done exactly. But I think as time went on, it became even more clear. There are still those who believe that the fairy photographs are genuine, that they really did see fairies, of course. But I think probably for most people, it discredited spiritualism as well.
There's a kind of interesting circle in there as well, where you mentioned the Fox sisters. So had their case in 1848 in Hydesville, New York, where again it's two adolescent girls are involved with starting this, what may well have been a hoax in itself, and kickstarting the modern version of the spiritualist movement. And then if it starts with two adolescent girls and then almost finishes with two adolescent girls, there's a kind of rather nice symmetry about that in a way.
Well, there is, yeah. I mean, the similarities between the two instances are very striking. I think it also, in many respects, illuminates certain aspects of the gender dimension to this as well. One of the reasons why Conan Doyle was so amenable to accepting the veracity of what was said was because he thought, well, they're these two nice girls. They wouldn't be so dishonest as to perpetrate this hoax, but also they wouldn't be capable of putting together such a sophisticated fake photograph. So he underestimated them on both fronts.
Yeah, there's also that line. I think it was in one of Gardner's letters where he talks about the innocence of not just girls but also of youth, isn't it? And particularly prepubescent youth, really, because he has that line about I fear now that we are late because almost certainly the inevitable will shortly happen. One of them will fall in love, and then hey presto.
Yeah, so that idea that I think that the onset of women's adult sexuality is sort of incompatible with this kind of access to fairy perception. Again, is part of that, and the association of fairies with a kind of prepubescent innocence, particularly of girls as well. It's Conan Doyle had this kind of old-fashioned gentleman's kind of attitude towards women, didn't he?
Yeah.
Overall, a sort of chivalric kind of view of them, and I think it partly plays to that, doesn't it? That his view of the girls, his unwillingness to consider them as capable of deceit, but also this investment in them as in some way being kind of pre-sexual. I mean, Elsie was 16 at the time. She was 19, engaged to be married when the second group of photographs were taken, and it's kind of, well, sooner or later.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think we should really talk about the exhibition itself and how it came about, because I mean, this is clearly you've done an enormous amount of research into this, and you've uncovered whole areas of the story that have been beyond the reach of other scholars for a very long time. So, first of all, thank you for that. But also, I mean, when you came to preparing the exhibition, what was at the front of your mind, and what was there anything that really surprised you when you started to get into the vaults and you were able to dig around the resources that were there?
And there were a few things that surprised me. I think I've managed to include most of that in the exhibition. So the fact that the negatives weren't the original negatives was probably the biggest surprise. There was also that correspondence between Gardner and Edith Wright, which I found intriguing, and I couldn't find a place really to include that without it feeling like it was disappearing down a rabbit hole. But there's a whole separate kind of strand to this about what happened to the original negatives. There's another sort of fascinating story which again didn't make it into the exhibition about a second set of photographic negatives that were auctioned in 2001. Edward Gardner left, when he died, left a briefcase that contained various of these effects, including a complete set of negatives, which were labelled as being the ones that were used for making the lantern slides and all the prints for publication.
Yeah.
So there's this possibility that actually the ones in the Brotherton were not quite the final generation, but there was a final set made after that, which are actually the ones that Gardner had for himself as the originals. That bag was sold and is now in the Utsunomiya Fairy Museum in Japan, just outside Tokyo. And those negatives now seem to have gone missing as well, interestingly. So there's a whole other kind of sort of layer of kind of fascinating stuff there. But I mean, in terms of what I wanted to do with the exhibition, I think what really struck me about it, as I almost immediately, was that this wasn't the kind of straightforward narrative that I thought it was. I'd heard some things about the Cottingley Fairies, and there's a sort of a myth about it, isn't it, that these girls hoaxed Conan Doyle, to put it in its most simplistic terms, and that's not really what happened at all. And the things that struck me about it were that the girl's story had been to a large extent marginalized because of Conan Doyle's celebrity, which that had been the thing that everybody had really been interested in. That question about how the creator of Sherlock Holmes could have been taken in. So it all becomes about that. And I thought there was this really interesting story about the girls and what had happened around them, but also the deceptions that had been involved in Edward L. Gardner's involvement in the case, the improvements that he made to the negatives, the suppression of the originals, which he didn't really tell anybody about. And then Conan Doyle's own kind of self-deception, really. He presents himself as being an objective adjudicator, really, looking at the evidence that's been presented and saying, well, you could look at it this way, you could look at it that way, but I'm satisfied on the balance of evidence and the rigorous testing that we've put it to, that as far as I can see, this is all genuine. So he presents himself as that kind of objective, almost outside observer of it. But of course, that's not what he was at all. He was very, deliberately conducting a campaign that was strategic and was calculated to have a certain effect, and then he had his counterattack up his sleeve and all the rest of it. And it's the intersection of those sort of three different stories, really, that I wanted the exhibition to try to capture. And in the exhibition text, I describe it as an accidental conspiracy. Normally a hoax is a deliberate conspiracy to deceive, but I think what you have with this is a series of deceptions. You've got the girls with the sort of family prank. You've got Gardner with the suppression of the originals and the enhancement of the negatives, and then you've got Conan Doyle pretending to be objective when he's not really been objective at all. And with his global reputation and the role that Sherlock Holmes plays in all of that, it serves to amplify the other deceptions and give them a resonance and reach they wouldn't otherwise have. And so the exhibition was trying to take this sort of layered history, really, of at least three very different stories and different kinds of deception, and how the intersection between those things is what we think of as the Cottingley Fairies. But it's not a single story. It's not a single strand, I don't think.
No, it's fantastic. Well, I think we're getting towards the end of the podcast, so I think we better wrap it up here. But just to say, I think you've uncovered an amazing amount of new insight into the Cottingley Fairies case, and it's been fantastic to talk to you about the exhibition and about the case more broadly. How can people access the exhibition? This is open to the public for a while longer.
Yeah, it's it's at the Treasures of the Brotherton Library Gallery, which is in the Parkinson Building at the University of Leeds. It's open on weekdays. It's not currently open at weekends, and obviously access to the gallery will, to a large extent, be determined by the national situation in terms of the pandemic. But it's open to the public at the moment, so it's free of charge. You can just wander in off the street into the Parkinson Building and look around the exhibition, and it'd be great to have lots of people coming and seeing it. There's some fantastic material in there. We've got cameras in there. One of the cameras that belong to Francis Griffiths, and another camera that's the same as the model of the original camera that was used for the first 2 photographs. Those have been loaned by the National Science and Photography Museum in Bradford. And that exhibition is on until November 2022. So there's almost another year to run.
Brilliant. So plenty of time for people to get up there and view it. That's fantastic. Look, thank you so much for joining us today, Merrick. We've really enjoyed it, and we wish you all the best with the exhibition.
Thanks, Merrick.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you.
So thanks again to Merrick for joining us on the podcast. It was fascinating to hear his insights into this multifaceted story. Paul, what have we got on the podcast next time?
Next time we have a very dark story set during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, The Lord of Chateau Noir.
You couldn't really get further away from the Cottingley Fairies than that, could you?
Not really.
So thank you very much for joining us, and until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.